Hello, welcome to Davos and the launch of the 26th Annual Global CEO Survey from PwC. I'm Nisha Pillay. It's my pleasure to be with you today. In a moment, we're going to be joined by Bob Moritz, Global Chairman of PwC, who's going to talk us through the main findings of the survey, answer your questions, of course, and if you're joining us online, please do send in your questions, and I'll put them to Bob on your behalf. So here we are then, gathered together in Davos with a backdrop of a war still raging in Ukraine, inflationary pressures not yet resolved, and of course the shadow of COVID. What are they going to be discussing here at the World Economic Forum? Well, no doubt amongst other things, the need for more effective collective action. And as for business leaders, well, they face their own set of challenges, including, increasingly, the need to reinvent themselves. That is one of the key and most striking findings from this year's survey, in fact. Almost 40% of business leaders told us that they fear that their businesses, their organizations might not be financially viable in 10 years' time. That's a staggering statistic, isn't it? Almost 40% wonder about the financial viability of their businesses. So to analyze that, cast some light on it, and talk us through the rest of the findings, let's welcome now Bob Moritz. Bob, come on up.
Nisha, good to see you.
So I thought that was pretty jaw-dropping.
It is.
So put it in context for us. What are the main challenges that CEOs face going into the futures? What are they worried about?
So let's first put into context the 40% headline around the fact that CEOs are worried about being disrupted such that they're not economically viable in the next 10 years. It is extremely pessimistic from one angle, but it actually is eye-opening and potentially opportunistic in another. CEOs that recognize this now ask themselves the question, what should I do about it in driving the change necessary to make it happen? Now, two other points relevant to this particular data point for us all to think about. First, this is a fairly consistent statistic across all sectors.
And all regions too?
Not all regions. So let's come back to the regional point. But from a sector perspective, you see a fair degree of consistency on a worldwide basis. At the regional level, we run the range from countries like China and Korea at the high end that are really worried about that disruptive element over the next 10 years, whereas others, for example, Brazil, US, et cetera, not so much. So the range goes from 60, 70% on the high end to a 20-ish type of percent on the other end. And each one has a very unique set of facts and circumstances in terms of why they believe that. So it's important for us to peel back the onion and understand, is it driven by customer preferences and how they'll buy? Is it technology changes, regulatory changes, labor forces, other aspects like that? But all of those things are somewhere on the list that CEOs are worried about. The final point on this, CEOs have seen these trends for a while. There's not a lot of new in these trends. It's the combination of all these trends, and it's the speed and the magnitude of these trends that has an interdependency, a connection, and an amplifying effect on their organizations, that if they don't do something, they're really in trouble.
And where does climate change feature in this? Does it feature in their thinking?
Interestingly enough, from a climate change perspective, climate as a risk fell down at a lower level in the short to medium term, but it still remained important from an overall strategic perspective. What is important to realize, though, is a larger number of CEOs was spending significant time and energy on climate in terms of reduction of emissions, changing business processes, thinking about the cost and the cost issues associated with that to say, what's the implication this is going to have? And how does it affect primarily my supply chain and the progress that I make as an organization as I play in the larger society in terms of expectations I have? And you see it on the slide here in terms of where the CEOs are focused on climate. The last point I would make, some see climate as a risk and a liability. The ones that I think are really grabbing onto this very well and turning it into something are those that see it as an opportunity. I can bring forward a different offering, services and goods, a cleaner offering that maybe my consumers like and maybe they'll even pay a premium for. Those that see the upside potential, those are the ones that are going after the opportunity much more aggressively in terms of the changes that are necessary to be made.
Okay, so in addition to climate change, what are the other opportunities and threats that CEOs are grappling with at the moment?
So when you look across the pessimism that exists in terms of the transformation that these organizations are going to face, it's not surprising to anybody that the macroeconomic environment is top of mind. Inflation, broader policy issues, fiscal and monetary and otherwise, and it's really important to understand that this is a theme cutting across the world. Again, not a big surprise from what we have seen historically, leading to then CEOs being more worried about how do I react to all of that. The other ones you see on the slide are both longer term and systemic, but also come back to the one that's right in the middle, which is concerning to some extent, Nisha, which is the geopolitical risk. And here's where we see geopolitics not necessarily just focused on China-US relations, but much broader. You have the war in Russia. You have the question of the EU in terms of how Germany and France are getting along now. You have concerns rising in the Middle East and the role that it plays, particularly with energy being top of mind. And you've got the political agendas in various countries, some swinging very radically, causing CEOs to say, can I do anything about this? And what most of them are saying is, I can't control this, so let me focus on what I can control and do and take the necessary actions to be better prepared for a degree of scenarios that might play out, rather than spend all my time and energy contemplating the world and where it's going to go.
So with all these threats out there, what are CEOs saying about how they see overall economic growth?
So the headline news that we've talked about for many, many years, it is at an all-time high relevant to the pessimism. And let's put that pessimism into context. You see here on the slide, the 10-year horizon or so, it's at a 73% of the CEOs feeling pessimistic, and let's be clear, pessimistic about whether the economy is going to grow, stay neutral, or fall behind. Not a surprise when you look at predictions on GDP, and not a surprise when you look at inflationary pressures and interest rates and other aspects like that. So it is very important to put that into context of relativity compared to last year. The second thing that's important to focus on is the relativity of how CEOs feel about that point in their home countries. And we start to then see a little bit of difference with some of the feedback that's come. And then likewise, the question has to be, how are they thinking about their resiliency in that economic environment?
So what are they expecting in terms of their own organizations, growth for their own organizations, given the backdrop is so pessimistic?
So what you see here is a chart that shows the change year over year in terms of how they feel about their own ability to manage through this. And as you look, the year 2023, there's a 26% decrease in their confidence level as to whether they can grow revenues in the next 12 months compared to what they did the last 12 months. And that's where you're starting to see some differentiation. Here, you're seeing, for example, US CEOs more optimistic than, for example, some of the other CEOs in Europe. No surprise as you look at energy, inflation, and other aspects like that. And if you look, this slide will dictate it, there's a big difference between some countries on the far left looking at the world economy and theirs versus those on the right. So let me bring them to life. In the case of India, very worried about the global economy, less so about their own ability to grow revenues. Why? Because India as a country still has a lot moving forward, and they're still predicting a GDP of 6, 7, and maybe even trying to drive towards double-digit growth. If you look at the other side, it's primarily driven out of the inflationary pressures, the interest rates, and for that matter, the energy crisis that sits within it. But let's go to the middle. China, not a surprise because it's a relative game coming out of COVID. US already started that transformation and is moving forward, so you don't see that big of a gap between the companies and the economies themselves. So it's very important for us not to generalize, which is another theme coming through this, and it's very important to understand the reasons and rationale behind this more than anything else, as well as what companies are doing about it.
That's quite a chart, isn't it, with India and Brazil on one side and Germany and UK on the other. So how are CEOs responding to these economic challenges? What are they doing in terms of their own businesses?
Yeah, so when you look here, you've got a combination of levers of change that they are going after. No surprise, again, because most of it relates back to the macroeconomics. We're actually reducing cost as much as we can and trying to be more effective and efficient. We're trying to reduce debt and the like to be prepared and managing our business accordingly. What is very interesting, and this is the far right-hand side, which is the human capital element. 60% of the CEOs are not planning to, nor have they taken action in terms of headcount reductions. That's a global statistic. Now, why are they making that statement and why are they playing that game? Another data point from the survey, not on the slide, is many CEOs believe that attrition, the turnover from the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle, is going to remain the same, even in the world we're living in, i.e. a slowing economy. So if I've got significant attrition staying the same still, I've got to find capacity in reducing cost, the management for margins, make investments, and take care of people. I need to keep wages at a higher level, not a lower level, and I need to keep the employees actively engaged with compensation, benefits, upskilling, and other attributes, including flexibility of how and when they work. So the CEOs are playing a nuanced game now in terms of the actions they want to take. It does differ depending on the sector that you're in. Globally, you see this a little different country by country because of the severity of the economic crisis. Sector to sector, you see significant changes globally in places like chemicals, consumer, and the like. And in other cases, you're already starting to see in financial services and technology some of the changes with some of the restructurings that have done, starting with the large superscalers, for example, in tech, coming out of the US and other places. We'll watch that one carefully going forward.
Indeed. So another slide of two halves, really. So let's go back to geopolitical risks, which are clearly on the rise. Now, what were you saying earlier about US, China? Is it just that in your thinking, or do we need to go beyond?
It's definitely beyond that. The concept of geopolitical risks coming from anywhere, and clearly Russia, Ukraine was a surprise, is definitely top of mind for CEOs and, for that matter, politicians as they think about the social element of what those politicians have to do in dealing with their countries. As a result, you're getting much more fragmentation and siloed behavior. As a result, you're getting more regulation, more concerns about data, data privacy, and potentially cyber and cyber risks. So what you see in here from the data is we are adjusting and enhancing cyber protection. We're doing more in terms of data protection. We are very much adjusting supply chains. Many of them niche, not necessarily bringing it just back home. A lot of people assume we're going to bring that supply chain back to the home country. That's not the case. We actually see it wherever a country can provide me security, resiliency, cost effectiveness, and more greener or cleaner, we will take that option from supply chains perspective. What's not on the chart, though, is interesting. What we see anecdotally, many organizations are doing two things differently. They are scenario planning, much more so. Traditional budgeting and straight line forecasting over a multiple year period is not so easy anymore with the confidence level that we might have had in the past, because those scenarios and those tail risks will pop up. And second, they are re-looking at their organizational construct in terms of, what do I set up in this country to serve that country locally? What do I set up outside of that country to bring goods and services? And what decisions are being made where? So how you think about governance, oversight, and management is another thing that companies are thinking about, to play out multiple scenarios and be very quick to be able to react to the things they can't control.
So drawing all this together then, Bob, how are CEOs investing in the future? Are they investing in the future?
The biggest thing we see right now is a continuation of the digitization journey. And that is huge from a couple of perspectives. It's huge because organizations have to continually transform themselves to be more effective and efficient. They've got to survive the next 2 to 3 years to thrive over the next 10. Second, they've got to get the right information in the right people's hands. So what you see is the top 3 things they're doing. We're using AI to re-engineer processes to get that effectiveness and efficiency. We're using automation, centralization, standardization to get more effective, efficient, and reduce the friction inside of organizations. Get information to make better, faster decisions to the right people's hands in a fast-paced world. We're upskilling our people quite a bit to adapt those, and that includes the leaders in a big-time way. And last but not least, we are deploying cloud technologies that enable us to actually be much more flexible and scale up and scale down. So the digital acumen of organizations is something they are all focused on, and that is definitely consistent across all sectors and, for that matter, all countries. It's a little less slower, where, for example, technology might be more expensive versus the labor side. Brazil's a great example of that. Brazil had a lower disruptive risk to it. One of the concerns that it had, the CEO group had, it will disrupt itself because of technology, because they haven't advanced it as much. They see that coming more so in the next 10 years.
Okay, so let's just step back for a moment. This survey this year has a pretty pessimistic kind of tinge to it, wouldn't you say? So are there any optimistic nuggets lurking in there?
There's a few. First, I do think you've got a world where the economic environment is much different than, for example, 2008 and 9. That was a big shock to the system. Everyone was concerned, and that pessimism was evident there. The degree of confidence that the CEOs can manage through that is much better now than it was in 2009. Second, many of the things we're talking about are known. It's a question now, what do I do about them, as opposed to trying to figure out the unknowns. Third thing I would say, which is a positive, is the corporations and their C-suites and management teams are very much focused around this social impact, and particularly around the employee base and the labor force. To have them consciously make decisions saying, I don't want to do a large-scale reduction, is much different than we've been in other recessions or in shocks to the system, where the automatic was, I've got to cut my workforce. And last but not least is everybody, again, going back to this slide, thinking about how do I get my workforce skilled for the future is another opportunity as we think about the transformation. So there's a lot of opportunity. The question now is, how do CEOs and management teams get ready for that opportunity, drive the change necessary, and accomplish in a way that satisfies the stakeholder group?
We started this conversation with that headline-grabbing statistic, if you like, that almost 40% of CEOs are really concerned about the commercial viability of their organizations. So it begs the question, can leaders reinvent their organizations? What can they do to enable the reinvention of their organizations?
Yeah, there's a few things here that is interesting coming out of this year's CEO survey. We've not done a lot of questions in this regard in the CEO survey. We've done a lot in other surveys. So the first question is, are you as the CEO and are your management team driving the change necessary and creating the stress in the system that is constructive, not paralyzing, but constructive to get change moving forward? In order to do that, the CEO himself or herself have to facilitate the right culture. And that means you've got to put hard issues on the table. That means you need to encourage a debate. That means you need to get your leadership team to understand the short term and the long term and the trends that are happening. So much more education, much more encouragement for our leaders to debate, ultimately decide and make some actions and take some decisions and make some actions, very important. And last but not least, take some risks. The only way these organizations can move forward is by placing some bets and, yes, tolerate maybe some small failures, but learn very quickly and adjust. And you see that with some of the things that are both missing as well as the things that are opportunistic right now for the CEO community. Last point I would make on this one, Nisha, is you are starting to see the difference between those organizations that have the right culture and are driving the change and their confidence level. The correlation between the confidence level of a CEO and their business that's doing these things, it's a heck of a lot higher, both in terms of their ability to raise revenues, as well as their ability to not be disrupted as much over the next 10 years.
Fingers crossed. So those are some of the main findings from the survey. Would anyone like to put a question? I think I know who you are, but we'll bring a mic to you. And then please remind the whole room who you are and which organization you represent. I think it's Larry, isn't it?
Yeah, hello, I'm Larry Elliott from The Guardian. I just wondered whether one of the risks that CEOs perceive is that the era of ultra-low interest rates are over. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about businesses surviving for the last 10 or 15 years that might not have survived in a more normal macroeconomic environment. Is the idea that interest rates are not going to go back to zero anytime soon and could settle at around 4 or 5% one of the factors which is behind the quite pessimistic view people have over the medium-term outlook?
Yeah, Larry, great question. I'm going to bring in a couple of the delegates that PwC has here, if you don't mind. Kevin Ellis, if I can maybe bring you into this from our perspective, but I'll provide an overview. First, I think there is a major concern that we are going back to more of the older ways rather than what I'll call the monetary policies that exist today. The second thing it's interesting to watch is how many leadership teams have never managed through a higher interest rate environment and have forgotten, candidly, what, at least looking, and I don't want to point anybody out, the age group of this group might be relevant to the experiences that we had where interest rates were normally double digit. But Kevin, maybe give a perspective of what you're seeing in the marketplace.
Yeah, Thanks, Bob. I think you're right. I think also both the employees, we talked earlier about the survey, about the need to effectively hoard talent and develop talent. A lot of the employees in these companies won't have seen the interest rates at this level as well. And that's also causing, I think, stress in the system too. There will obviously be, I think, across Europe and probably across the world, more insolvencies. Because again, going back to your point in the question, there have been a lot of companies, I suspect, that have probably survived it through with support. That support won't be there any longer, the higher interest rates, and maybe that will be a kind of a change in the market and a reduction in kind of what have been probably termed zombie companies. So we're seeing a lot of that change coming too.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Larry, the other thing I will say, and we don't want to miss this, one of the other ways the CEOs are reacting to this environment that they see in front of them is, in fact, diversifying and changing their portfolio. So you are seeing, even though the deal market has slowed down significantly, a lot of questions around what should my ideal portfolio mix be, and that means selling as well as buying as they reposition themselves for the future to be reacting to the customer needs. And what's driving that, and tying it back to your question, now the question becomes how interest rate sensitive are those businesses as well? And will I get the ROI and can I extract the value from them? And that's causing boards, both supervisory teams and management teams, to really question the ROI and the return on these more so, and be a lot more diligent in the decisions they're making, even though the analysis is going on right now.
So we've got a question that's come in online. I'll just read it out to you, Bob. And it's saying basically, can you tell us a bit more about the mood among CEOs in Europe in view of the war still going on and all the other consequences that come out of it? How are they going to be operating in the coming months?
I pointed out already some of the concerns that's there, but what I can do is bring up Petra, who leads our PwC Europe organization, as well as Germany specifically. But Petra, maybe you can give a perspective on this point.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the question, and thanks for having me. So looking at the mood of the European CEOs, the results of the survey are not much different from the ones we've seen on a global level. So I would say from a record optimism 365 days ago to a record pessimism, what we're seeing that in Western Europe, 75% of the CEOs are expecting decline of global growth, and only 39% of those are expecting their own business growing. So if we then look at Germany, and you've just seen the numbers, it's even higher. It's 82% of the CEOs expecting a decline of global growth. So this is a very pessimistic mood. Yeah? If we ask the CEOs what their concerns are on the top of the mind, and these are the direct and indirect effects of the war. It's the macroeconomic volatility, it's geopolitical risks, and it's inflation. So these are the top three concerns. And so what leaves me positive is we see as well the CEOs in Europe sticking with their long-term strategic transformational projects. So what are they doing? They're investing basically in technology projects, long-term technology strategic projects, automation of processes, including artificial intelligence, including cloud. And they are investing at the same time in upskilling their employees. So it's a combination of people, technology. Only a small portion of the Western Europe CEOs have laid off people or are not sort of willing in investing in upskilling. So I think this is a really good sign. What we also see is investments in climate neutrality of their business model, as well as in alternative energies. And I think this is very special, having the energy crisis much more here in Western Europe and in Germany.
Petra, if I can, the other things, thank you for that. The other 2 points I would make relevant to Europe, you probably see more negativity because of what they perceive to be excess regulation. Not surprising, some of the regulatory stuff that's coming out of the EU directives, for example, is causing them to be concerned about cost, complexity, and compliance with those rules and regulations. And you hit on it, but it's worth amplifying. Labor, more broadly, as a theme across all of Europe is a bit problematic. And that's not only in terms of strikes and union issues and some of the things we're seeing across various countries there, but also how is that going to transform my business and have implications? And that's why it's forcing the CEOs in Europe to be probably more pessimistic on economy as much as it is on the disruption over the next 10 years as well.
Yeah, you're right. So it's more than 60% that the CEOs are challenged by regulation. And that's the second concern they have. The first one is scarcity of labor force and competencies in the market. So.
Thanks.
Great. Petra, thank you very much. Shall we have another question? Please. Sort of in the middle over there. Please tell us who you are and which organization you represent.
Hi, Courtney Brown, economics reporter at Axios. I'm super interested in one of the slides you showed that basically said that CEOs, even though they are anticipating a downturn or recession, they are really still planning on keeping the folks that they have at their companies, not laying people off. And that's easy to say when the shocks that you're anticipating haven't happened yet. But I mean, what do you think? Like, what type of shock do you think it would take for employers to rethink this idea that, gosh, we don't want to lay anyone off because labor's in really short supply?
Yeah, great question. If I can, I'll bring Tim Ryan into this one as well. We have spent a lot of time thinking about the human capital element. What's going to be really important is going to be how the CEOs balance this. And we saw it during COVID. COVID definitely came up with the mindset of I've got to protect my employee base as much as possible. They didn't cause this issue, right? The pandemic did, and as a result, I'm going to try to protect as long as I possibly can. And we saw companies do that for a good 12 to 18 months, but at some point, you may be reduced hiring to offset, for example, the longevity of the workforce that you have existing today. What it is forcing organizations to do is very much think about how am I spending my available capital in the human capital space to get the most out of them. And maybe Tim, describe a little bit what you're seeing in the US, but also the broader human capital level.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks for the question. The enduring theme coming out of the survey is good quality management's going to win. And that was true a year ago, and it was true 10 years ago. And great quality management is putting the right emphasis on the quarter or the year, but they're looking forward to reinvent themselves for all these trends that we're talking about, climate, cloud, new way of looking at globalization. And the leading organizations are focusing their management time on how do you maximize your human capital. They understand the trends. We're short talent across the board. Many countries, including the US, are aging populations. 4 or 5 million people left the workforce because of COVID and the wealth that they have. Immigration is tight in many parts across the globe. And so the leading quality management teams are asking themselves, how do I mobilize that talent, even if the business is slowing down in the short term? Because I'm going to reinvent myself to go get that market share, to go outcompete my competition. And that's the dialogue we're having in the boardroom. Now, to be clear, some teams are doing that much better than others. This is a time to look at companies, not sectors. The boat, it won't rise with all tides. We're going to see great quality management, whether it be human capital or other elements, they will win every time. And the leading companies are doing the things that Petra and Bob talked about. They're investing in their people because they know they're hard to get. They know what history shows the economy will come back if we do hit the dip, and they want to have that talent to get on with the reinvention around climate, cloud, and new ways of globalization more than ever before.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. The only other thing I'll add to this is bringing some connected thinking to this. As we talk to the CEOs, idealistically, they were going to protect the workforce. They were going to try to upskill them. And again, they recognize they're going to have to pay appropriately in terms of wages and benefits. To Tim's point, they are going to redesign process and automate. Coming out of that will be more capacity, to Tim's point. What you also see, though, is CEOs saying, I'm going to diversify my businesses and change my consumer experiences. So I will take that capacity of human capital and put it in another place. And that's what Tim was describing in terms of the human capital, or the quality management systems. The organizations that are saying, I found both savings, financial, and human capital, and I'm going to redeploy that in the biggest upside, those are the ones that are going to thrive in the world that we see in front of us right now. And it's going to be need for speed to get that to come to life, because again, this world is going to move much more dynamically in the next 10 years than we probably saw it in the last 10.
And we've got another online question for you. In fact, it's come in from Christine. Thanks for sending in your question, Christine. And it's asking, why is it that CEOs in the Asia-Pacific region seem to be more worried about their long-term business model viability? What's going on here?
I've got Raymond Chow, who leads both our China business as well as our Asia-Pac business. So maybe, Raymond, why don't you start with that one, and I'll add up some color commentary.
Sure, Bob. It's actually quite interesting. If you look at the survey, what happens is the Asia-Pac CEOs are saying that they are very concerned and is more than the counterparts globally in terms of their business model, their businesses, their business organizations, whether they're going to survive in 10 years' time. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. If you look at, obviously, the significant disruptions that the CEOs have experienced over the last few years, whether it is the trade war, whether it's the geopolitical situation, or whether it is because of the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. It's had significant disruptions. They've experienced that over the last little while. But what is interesting is, and is actually created the additional burden right now, is the fact that they are also trying to, given the current economics at this point, the macroeconomic environment, they're also very focused on managing the short-term profits and trying to balance between the short-term profits and the long-term sustainable growth that they need to achieve. Now, one of the things that I think the CEOs have recognized is the fact that they need to continue to transform. And if you look at the investments that they need to make, but at the same time trying to manage the short-term profits and the speed to that transformation to achieve that sustainable growth is one of the reasons I think the CEOs are saying, hey, I'm very concerned, more so than the counterparts globally. The other thing I think it is quite relevant is the climate risk. The Asia-Pacific region is very vulnerable to climate risk. And I think the CEOs recognize that. And in fact, the survey is saying that in the medium term, and because we've got this short-term profitability issue that they're trying to manage as well, but they are willing to invest more in terms of managing climate risk than their global counterparts. So I think these are all the factors driving the CEO's sentiment at this point. But what is interesting, though, despite the long-term concern, they are less pessimistic about the short-term results. And particularly, you look at countries like China, India, and Indonesia. They are far more less pessimistic than the counterparts globally. And that's the Asia-Pacific region.
Thanks.
To Raymond's point, when you look at the predictions relevant to GDP growth, the underlying fundamentals in Asia, a rising middle class, a much more affluent middle class actually buying more, consuming more, those are all positive things. So the pessimism is less, even though we're worried about the global economy as they look at their home countries. That degree of pessimism in terms of what drives it is definitely differentiated amongst the countries. Going back to Raymond's point, if I can just bring it to life, China was more concerned about the disruption risk over the next 10 years, primarily because of climate and specifically energy-related prices as we move away from coal. China will have to do that at some point in time, and there's going to be a cost associated with it. If you go to Indonesia and, for example, India, a lot more around how consumers will now consume in a much different way, which will be much more costly, and the use of technology in that. Whereas China's already started to do that when you look at the large-scale transformation in terms of how consumption has actually been scaled up significantly in that part of the world. So each one's got a slightly different nuance in terms of that driving force. And yes, climate is a big issue for the region, both from a physical risk perspective, but equally as important, it's actually the cost issue that's going to be problematic as they think about the supply chains and how they are more availing to the rest of the world.
That is fascinating and hadn't occurred to me, I must say. Any more questions? Would you like to come right here in the front row? Please tell us who you are and where you work.
Thank you. Ming J. Wang from China Daily. Just adding on to the previous question you were talking about. So my question is, what are the moods for the global CEOs towards China? Because for the last 3 years, it seems to the outsiders that China seems to turn internally, inwards, because they put a lot of focus on trying to stem the virus. But since the end of last year, Chinese president went to G20 summits, Indonesia, Thailand, and also invited the German chancellor to visit and the European Council president. And all of a sudden, at the end of December, China just opened up. I think it's kind of surprised a lot of analysts. So I'm quite interested to see how global CEOs, they are reacting, to China's, sudden opening up. Thank you.
It's a great question. So let me provide a little context. Over the last 8 or so years, China and the US have always been the #1 or #2 country CEOs want to invest in if it wasn't their home country. A few years China was first, and a few years then the US was first, and it was relatively close. About 4 years ago, the US took a little bit of a lead relevant to China, and over the last 2 to 3 years, that lead has increased. But China still remains a strong #2 compared to Germany, UK, and Australia, and in India. So their prominence still very important. The second thing I would say, and this is more anecdotal, they are encouraged by and are less fearful now of some of the concerns they had previously because of the policy decisions that have been made by President Xi, particularly coming out of the next 5-year congressional session that was held recently. And that goes not only to the role China is playing in the global economy, but also to what he's doing on the domestic economy. And that's very important. Which leads to the third piece, which is many global CEOs are looking at China and saying, still opportunity, maybe some risks. I've just got to be smarter and more agile in managing those risks. And that goes back to my earlier comment. How do I organize myself there? Do I have businesses that are set up to serve just the domestic market? Do I have decisions and manufacturing sites and others that serve the rest of the global economy? And maybe I separate those a little bit more so. So I'm very local for local purposes, and I move forward. And the last point I would say to your question, the world was expecting a China to play a big role globally when we thought about the Belt and Road initiatives. And the last couple of years, because of both the domestic economy slowing, COVID, et cetera, that's waned a bit. So the world is now questioning, okay, is that going to re-engage as another alternative source of capital, labor, and financial support relevant to investment? So it's still there, still strong, and I think it's got a big opportunity on a going forward basis.
Another online question for you, Bob. It's about supply chain disruptions. How are CEOs feeling about it? How much of a risk is it to them? And especially, what are Indian CEOs doing on the ground to manage those risks?
Great. So I've got Sanjeev here, I think, who's here from India. Actually, he leads our business there. Hey, Sanjeev, come on up, and why don't you take the first crack at this?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So I think supply chains are one of the things that Indian CEOs are doing, because he said that they are looking to reinvent themselves. So supply chain diversification is something that the Indian CEOs are quite certainly focused on. It is about localization of the supply chains, which I think are absolutely critical for them. It's not about saying that we are not going to be dependent on the rest of the world at all, but it is making sure that there is a certain amount of supply so that you are less dependent on the world. India, as you know, is trying to do a bunch of FTAs at this point in time. We've done one with Australia already. There's one with UAE already done. The others with UK and the European Union currently in the works. And this is again an effort on part of the government to make sure that we are actually able to secure India's position as it currently stands vis-a-vis areas of its strength. Look at for instance, pharmaceuticals, which has been an area of huge strength for us. So anything which is of area of huge strength, we need to make sure that we're either localizing or nearshoring our supply chains. I think that's the key focus from an Indian standpoint.
Appreciate that. And if you can, I'll bring Tim back up relevant to the supply chain issue. But I do want to come back before I have him give you a U.S. perspective on this. Most organizations right now, as Sanjeev said, are focusing on re-looking at their supply chain. And particularly Russia, Ukraine brought a new and different highlight to it relevant to security of it and resiliency of it. But now, and particularly for India, they've got the ability to scale and be a supplier to the world. They can do that economically, and they've got a labor force that's well educated at a lower cost base that actually enables it to happen. The thing that's missing is how do they make it greener for the benefit of the world, as the rest of the world will have to demonstrate their supply chains, their goods and services are much more greener as accountability comes in the mix. And the reason I wanted to bring Tim up here is you have the U.S. rethinking that as well from a macro policy perspective with the Inflationary Reduction Act, which has a lot of this supply chain concept embedded in it. But Tim, maybe give a perspective, 3 angles. View of the U.S. CEOs, supply chain specifically, and then the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So view of U.S. CEOs overall, I would say is slightly glass half full. Like notwithstanding the numbers, and Bob earlier showed the sector cuts, The reality is, I'll go back to my theme earlier, great quality management teams are finding ways to offset these headwinds. They're finding ways to offset higher labor costs, higher supply chain costs, higher interest rates, and they're finding ways to outcompete the competition. And they're finding ways to still get big pieces of very attractive markets. We've been incredibly impressed with how leading U.S. companies have found ways to deal with the headwinds. They're getting stretched more than they ever have before, but generally doing a very good job, especially those really, really top management teams. So they're very in tune with the headwinds they were seeing coming out in this and other surveys. But net, they're still doing a very good job. And I come out slightly glass half full, clearly not as good as bullish as last year or the year before, but still a pretty good view on where they see growth in 2023. As it relates to supply chain, I'll share this perspective. When President Trump started trade wars, supply chain got notice. When you then saw the issues around COVID and supply disruption, supply chain moved into the boardroom. When much of the Western world pulled out of Russia with Ukraine, it then was the main topic in the boardroom. And all of a sudden, CEOs got incredibly focused on where they were sourcing products, where they were sourcing parts, where they were sourcing supplies. And the name of the game is not politics. The name of the game is de-risking. And what U.S. companies are massively focused on is de-risking their supply chain in a world where you can't predict it, because that's what COVID, that's what Russia-Ukraine taught U.S. CEOs, and they're looking at ways for de-risking. And many countries are the beneficiary of that as they look to de-risk what they see in supply chain going forward. And that's where we see massive investment. That goes to the Inflation Reduction Act, Bob. What we saw in the Inflation Reduction Act is massive incentive for businesses to look to the United States to bring on nearshoring. Not completely, to Raymond's point, you're going to see a number of different areas, but you're looking at opportunities incented by the government, especially for those that are viewed as critical to national security, critical to consumers, particularly like medical devices and critical means of technology like chips, to bring it back on shore. I suspect that's just the beginning as politics weighs into business a bit, but your Inflation Reduction Act gave a number of businesses the opportunity to invest in the United States in ways they never did before.
And that Reduction Act was beneficial not only for the U.S. companies, again, good economic decisions, but actually the foreign companies wanting to invest in the U.S., hence the reason it went very big, and you saw an increase in the gap relevant to the U.S. and China, because you saw that stability, the government working more so to make it happen, and that's why that gap continued to actually differentiate itself.
So our meeting is drawing to a close now. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to sneak in one last question to Bob. And this is it. Bob, what advice can you give to CEOs today at such a tricky juncture?
First off, Nisha, thank you very much for doing this. There was a lot to be covered in a relatively short period of time, and there is important themes, but very important nuances when you look at this by sector and by country. I will open it up. We will have the opportunity after this to answer questions, and all of the delegates will make themselves available for that, as well as myself. Nisha, to your question on the CEOs and advice more broadly, a couple of things come through the CEO survey. One is CEOs today are more than the majority focused on the short term. It is that crisis management in the world that we're seeing, and we're ill prepared to deal with the enormity of all of the things hitting all at the same time, and the interdependencies and the scale and impact. And equally as important, the uncertainty that comes from that. So the advice we would give is, going back to where Tim went, a quality management system, a quality leadership team is focusing on striking the right balance between the short term and the long term. It's not one or the other. It is not my bottom line at the expense of societal implications. It's managing both. It's harder to do, but managing both is going to actually pay dividends in the short and the long term. And any decision you make today should have optionality built into it, so you as an organization should and can move with speed. The biggest thing we're seeing right now is how quickly can people scale up and or scale down? How quickly can they make decisions in terms of where to invest or not invest? How can they take the risks, maybe fail, but course correct very quickly and learn from that and benefit from that? And how can they get their leadership teams equipped to operate in this new and different, interconnected, and extremely difficult world? And that's then the investment you need to make in leaders, not just, quote unquote, your employee base. And with respect to those leaders, we would say they've got to be trusted leaders going forward, who can inspire, who can empower, who can enable. And if you're able to do those things in your organization and create the right DNA, you can get the cultural change, you can get the change management bought into, and you can get results short-term, long-term, and ensure your survivability, sustainability, and economic prowess.
You make it sound so simple. Thank you so very much, Bob.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. We appreciate it, and we'll take questions afterwards.
That's all we have time for now. May I invite you all to please download the survey. It's full of golden nuggets, and you can find it at ceosurvey.pwc. That's ceosurvey.pwc. From Bob Moritz and me, Nisha Pillay, thank you and goodbye.